Wow, 2 empty chairs. If Clint Eastwood were here, he could do a panel. I'm going to talk about a judo flip in energy for the Yukon. And a judo flip, of course, is a move that you do when you have, when you use an opponent's weight and energy against him. And, it's something you use when you have a big, hairy, ugly, implacable foe. Like, say you were in Math 10 at F.H. Collins and the class bully found out you let him copy the wrong answers off the midterm. Something like that. But that's a different story. Today, we're going to talk about energy. So energy has always been a huge problem here in the Yukon. I can't go as far back as Justin, just 100 years, but still a big problem. There we go. This is my great-grandfather, Antoine Cyr, or as the Anglos in Whitehorse called him, how they pronounced it, Tony. And he came here. He was one of the guys that went over the Chilkoot Pass. He never made it to Dawson City because he came to Whitehorse and found that perfect trifecta of opportunity: cold, people, and trees. And so he became what I like to call an energy distribution entrepreneur, a woodcutter. It was a good job for him. He, raised his family. He had a nice house in the suburbs on the edge of town, which was 6th and Steele at the time. And, unlike his competitor, Buzzsaw Jimmy, he did it without losing any major body parts. Just a few fingers here and there. But he spent basically his whole life delivering energy in the Yukon. And, that added to our GDP. It was a job. It generated tax revenues. But, because he was putting so much effort into fuel delivery, wood delivery, he didn't have enough time to build more old log churches. He couldn't look for gold. And he certainly didn't do anything like invent the chainsaw and make his great-grandchildren, wealthy and idle. And in fact, he and his, Buzzsaw and the guys, they never really solved the energy problem. And so there was this huge burden of living in the Yukon. And in the 1930s, guess what? A global financial crisis hits. Commodity prices go through the floor and the mining sector basically shuts down. And the people in Ottawa get all nervous and start cutting spending in the north. Sound a little bit familiar? So at that time, the Yukon economy went completely dead. Whitehorse was down to around 300 people, which meant that Tony and his family and his kids represented 3% of the population of Whitehorse. So this was a very quiet time, and it really underlines, I think, for us where we stand on energy. Energy is a huge burden for us. And here's some numbers that show it. This is StatsCan data that shows the average energy expenditure of a Yukon household. It's about $5,000 per year, and that includes electricity, transport, and home heating. And we're by no means the worst in the country. You could be in the NWT, but no one wants to be in the NWT. But still, $5,000 a year, it's a lot of money. My friend Andrea Simpson, who is going to be talking, runs this fantastic dance program. And if any of you have ever seen the kids perform here on this stage, it's amazing. If you ever talk to them after and find out how engaged they are, how inspired they are about dance, it's even more amazing. And now, Andrea told me her heating and rent costs, and in case there are other, dance tycoons in the audience, I'm not going to say the number, but it's very large. She has to basically sell a lot of dance lessons every month just to pay for the heating bill. And, thank God we have Andrea here in the community because it's a great program. But, let's be honest, she could run the same program in Airdrie, Alberta or Chilliwack, BC and probably make more money. And the other thing we have to think about is who are all the Andreas we don't know about? What are all the things our city doesn't have because the people that could have done them moved away, decided they couldn't make enough money because of, energy, that extra $5,000 a year on top of everything else. And if we want this city to be the place where you can have, the happiest and most prosperous, vibrant community, which we do, this is something we have to deal with because being at a constant competitive disadvantage on the energy front is going to hurt us in the long run, especially if we don't continue to get billion-dollar checks from Ottawa. So not only do we use too much energy, we use the wrong kind. This is a complicated chart. On the y-axis is the percentage of your energy use by type, and on the x-axis, transportation, residential, commercial, etc. The dark blue area is essentially fossil fuels, and the light blue area is electricity, mostly from hydro, from our two big dams. And so what you can see is 75% of our energy use comes from fossil fuels. Even worse than that, it mostly comes from oil, because we don't really have access to natural gas here. And so what that means is we're linked into the global energy markets. Those prices keep going up as China and India burn more fuel. And so we use a lot of energy and we use the wrong kind. And whatever you think of fracking, one thing's undeniable. Natural gas prices outside are at unbelievably low levels. So if we had an energy disadvantage before, this is us, this is outside. Now with their access and Chilliwack to shale gas and all that, they're down here. So it's getting even worse from a comparative point of view. And how much worse? Well, a lot worse, actually. The left side of this is a barrel of crude oil, West Texas Intermediate for the cognoscenti. And on the right, it's equivalent to natural gas. And, as they teach you in grade 1 at Whitehorse Elementary with graph reading, the right bar is a lot lower than the left bar. It's a lot cheaper, 77%, in fact, according to the PowerPoint wizard. So why is this bad for us? Well, it's bad for a bunch of reasons. Just think about, typical business or, the food bank or a charitable organization in Whitehorse. First of all, they have higher transportation costs, all their inputs, things they have to export, employee travel is higher. They have higher heating costs, like I was just mentioning with Andrea. They have higher transportation costs of their own for all their equipment and supplies they bring in to build their buildings, so their real estate costs are higher. They have higher costs for goods and services they buy from other people in Whitehorse who are also paying high energy costs. And for their labor costs, they're paying a bunch more to their labor, because if someone to live in the north, they have to get paid an extra amount to cover their own high heating costs for their own poorly insulated home. So sometimes when you see the statistics and it says, Yukoners make this much more on average than outside, well, a whole bunch of that on an after-tax basis gets eaten away by energy costs. So what does all this add up to? It adds up to less profit, less investment, fewer jobs, and less tax revenue for the government. And so these are things that hold us back from moving our community to the next level and making it, attracting more people, more services, and being more sustainable. So it doesn't have to be that way. Here's 2 photos. Now, I'm trained as an economist and used to be a diplomat, so I have absolutely no geological, hydrological, or engineering training, but from my careful assessment of these 2 photos, Norway and the Yukon have exactly the same hydroelectric potential. Now, the engineers out there will quibble with that because Norway gets more rain and has steeper mountains closer to cities, but basically the big point is they have, on the left in Rondaine National Park, they have mountains plus water, huge hydro resources. On the right, we have mountains plus water. We use 75% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. So this is something that the Norwegians would say was a little bit crazy. So let's look at how Norway uses that hydropower. This is electricity rates. I got friends in Yellowknife and a friend who moved from Whitehorse to Trondheim last year to tell me their power bills, and we downloaded the one from Iqaluit off the web. So in Whitehorse, it's, before taxes and subsidies, it's around 14, 15 cents a kilowatt hour. In Yellowknife, it's about double. Like I said, no one wants to live in Yellowknife. In Iqaluit, it's even worse. They have a huge subsidy program. They spend a whole bunch of their transfer payment from Ottawa on subsidizing energy. And then on the left, of course, is those pesky Norwegians, down around 6 cents, depending on what exchange rate you use. That is a huge difference. Basically heating their houses. They could even have electric cars, all this kind of stuff. What would that mean for the Yukon? The illustrative impact, if energy were cheaper, 59% cheaper like it is in Whitehorse, if we had Norwegian prices in Whitehorse and energy was that much cheaper, we would save about $90 million per year, or $2,500 for every Yukoner. So just think about that from an economic development point of view. Option 1 is the government could spend a lot of money advertising, going to conventions, having meetings, luring businesses in on economic development, or we could just say your energy will be $2,500 cheaper, per Yukoner, and it'll be easier for you to live here and do business here. The parallel obviously is Sarah Palin and our Alaskan friends with their dividend. This is an even bigger number per Yukoner than the dividend is in Alaska. So what you have to think about is it's sort of like a painless tax that we all pay. We don't really realize it, but every day, every month, every year, we pay a whole bunch extra on energy, which just inhibits economic activity, hurts our charities from being sustainable, and generally makes it harder to attract people and investment to the Yukon. So this chart, which is quite complicated, I think it's late enough in the day we can get into scatter charts. On the y-axis is the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity, and on the x-axis is gigawatt hours per year. That's the total amount of power generated. And the dots are different projects. This is from Yukon Energy's 20-year resource plan that they've come up with, and there's some great data and really interesting points of view in that document. And so you can see the options. Number one is diesel, which is at the dotted line. Basically, you can buy as many diesel generators as you want. It just costs a lot to run them because diesel is expensive. So that's why it's a dotted line. Basically, we can choose how many of those we want and run it out as big as we want. The next ones down are wood and wind, which are the red diamonds. Now, wood and wind can definitely be part of the mix. But you'll note that, according to Yukon Energy's calculations, they're not the most expensive. There's hydro solutions that are more expensive, the blue dots that are higher, but they are above 15 cents. The gray area is liquefied natural gas. There's so much fracking going on just south of the Yukon that one of the ideas is to bring liquefied natural gas to Whitehorse and burn it and make electricity. We don't know exactly how much that'll cost. It'll probably be in the gray zone somewhere, say 13 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour, which is more or less in the zone of what we pay now. But what's really interesting is these blue dots underneath the gray zone, big hydro. So what these are more dam projects, big dams that could generate a lot of power. Now, there's a few things to note about this. Number one, the big blue dots are underneath all the other dots in terms of cost. They're the cheapest power if you build this kind of thing. And then secondly, as you get bigger, the cost tends to go down. There's exceptions, but basically you get a scale effect. So now the words big hydro, even through the bright lights, I can see a whole bunch of people squirming out there. Because this is a very unpopular thing to say. But let me just take you through the logic of it, and then we'll have a talk at the end. So, big hydro. Let's just, for the purposes of this conversation, because this is an 18-minute, not an 18-hour talk, we're going to temporarily suspend disbelief on a few things. We're going to believe that large dams could get regulator and First Nations approval. Let's just take a try at that one, just believing it for a moment. Yukoners would accept a large footprint to get cheap power and lower greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, that another Asiac or Schwatka Lake could happen. And then thirdly, that our government and utility could actually build a dam without horrific cost overruns. So a few other buildings in Whitehorse we could make jokes about, but let's move on. Even if you assume all those things, though, you run into this economic doom loop, okay? So let's start at the upper right in the yellow one. There's not enough demand. There's not enough people and businesses here to use electricity. So therefore, there's no business case for a new dam because in the summer, so much water is going through Schwatka, we actually have a surplus. So there's no business case to make a big investment and have it be, half used for 20 years. So we have a lack of capacity, subscale operations. We build small sort of tweaks, small incremental things. That gives us a high cost of power because remember that scale curve? It means we're always building small projects. And then people look at it, Yukoners look at it and say, geez, electricity is expensive. I'm not going to invest in, heat pumps or electric vehicles or whatever. And so no one invests in the technology. They all go with oil options. Guess what? Not enough demand, and you just do it again. So the way out of this circle, perversely, counterintuitively, the only way out of it is to use a lot more electricity. And I don't mean 10% more. I mean to use like double or triple as much electricity as we do now. So this is the same chart again with the green zone added. And what the green zone is the amount of power that is represented if we migrated 50% of our non-transport, so this is not driving around, this is like all the other types of energy, 50% of that energy, we moved it from oil to electricity. We'd need somewhere over 300 gigawatt hours per year of extra power. So I think the interesting thing here is look at some of those blue dots that are at the lower right of the green zone. Basically, there's a couple projects there. That would give us that much power quite cheaply. And then, assuming, going back to the page with all the outlandish assumptions, assuming they could actually be built, we would have cheap power in large amounts here, and we could, at least end our addiction to oil, or not end it, but at least reduce it. So this is one of the things that we have to think about. Do we want to keep building high-cost energy options in the upper left and sort of doom ourselves to high energy costs here forever? Or do we want to do some kind of bold breakout move? This is what I'm calling the Judo Flip. So to continue into even more outlandish territory than the assumptions page, this is what everyone would have to believe in order for this to happen. YTG would actually have to give some leadership. Because they have a huge capital budget, they control all the regulatory issues and so on. What they would get out of it is a fundamental boost to economic development. That $5,000 per household would go down, and savings for their voters. Yukon Energy would probably have to give up its de facto monopoly on big projects because you'd want to do a public-private partnership to spread risk and get capital from somewhere else. But what Yukon Energy would get out of that is avoiding being the only bad guy in town when the project goes a bit off track. The investors from the Yukon and outside, they'd put investment dollars in. They might accept project risk. They might guarantee the rate of electricity and take the risk of cost overruns, and they, of course, would get profits. First Nations, they would have to give social license for hydro in their traditional territories and investment dollars from their development corporations. In return, they would get juicy dividends and economic development opportunities. Yukoners would have to invest in electric heat and vehicles, but they would get much cheaper power out of that. And then finally, the environmentalists, and this is a big issue, would have to give up their opposition to hydro, and in return, they would get dramatic reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. So, I'm sure everyone in this room has a different number or percentage probability they would put that this could ever happen, but it's something that we should think about if we want to think about where we're going in the Yukon. Because basically, what we have now is a choice where we are. We can stick with diesel, and as our surplus power from the dams that our ancestors built in the 60s and 70s is used up, and we use more and more diesel as we buy more and more iPods and mines open up, basically we'll move into Yellowknife territory. With a dramatic increase in our electricity costs and still using 75% of our energy from fossil fuels. Then there's the middle one, which is the status quo, but we sort of loop in some liquefied natural gas to keep us in the 15-cent area. And that's very much a status quo option. It's better than diesel, but it's not an energy shift. We still have 75% of our power coming from fossil fuels. We're still relatively expensive compared to Vancouver, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the Norwegian potential, the Judo Flip. Now, Norway is a very different country, has different topography and hydrology, even though I know nothing about that. I know that it is different over there. But nonetheless, some kind of strategy where we try to get really, really cheap power here and create our own little mini grid, which much cheaper power, which would just think about a future where taxes are lower here than in Vancouver, energy costs are lower than in Vancouver, there's no traffic, et cetera, higher quality of life, lovely little community. This is the kind of thing that for those of us who want to see Whitehorse, even more, a bit bigger, more vibrant, more services, even more vibrant and engaged community than today in the next 25 or 50 years, this is something that would help that a lot. And so this is why we now are at this cusp that the Asiac and Schwatka, we're reaching the limits. We have to decide between these strategies. And there's a powerful sort of incentive in our political system to go with the status quo plus LNG, or even stick with diesel, because it doesn't take any big decisions. You just sort of build an extra LNG generator or do nothing at all. And basically the question is, will we have this big discussion and make a decision to do something bold, or will we think small, stick with the status quo, and in 25 years be more like Yellowknife than Norway? And that is the big question for us.
Thank you very much.
30